So, Martin, I hate to bring him up, but did you follow any of the news from the whole Trump state visit last week?
So I'll be honest, James. I try to ignore pretty much all of it. From what I can gather, there was a lot of conversation about whether Prince Charles was wearing a tuxedo, as the BBC claimed, or if it was some kind of Windsor morning suit or uniform or something. And apparently there was a pink sash, and we weren't sure if Camilla matched it to Prince Charles or Prince Charles matched his ceremonial uniform to Camilla, and Melania Trump was in lots of kind of weird photographs looking like a sort of a floor lamp combined with something out of, The Handmaid's Tale. So, I can't stress enough. I have very limited interest in
Mm.
the state visit as a general topic.
All really important stuff. But the reason I'm talking about it this week is because what you might not have noticed, that aside from all of the parades and the protocol and pretty much, every single British person from the king on downwards putting on probably the bravest possible face in the world, there was actually a really interesting set of policy announcements as well relating to nuclear, which is something we've banged on a lot about on this podcast.
So this is what Trump threatening to nuke Jimmy Kimmel on Truth Social or something, or more substantial.
It's hopefully more substantial than that. So the good news is we're talking nuclear energy, not nuclear weapons. So I think it's safe to say, like I say, we're both fans of nuclear on this podcast because we want energy abundance. My argument has always been just to remind people that we can replace all the fossil fuels, but then do more than that. We can generate way more energy than we already need, and then do innovative, cool stuff with all that extra energy, power data centers, suck carbon out of the atmosphere, desalinate the sea, reduce energy prices. Another thing we can do. You can make energy that's too cheap to meter because we've already invented the technology to do it. It's called nuclear power.
Yeah. So this is the revolutionary idea that if you have more of a good thing, it's good.
Absolutely. You could call it abundance. And this is what's quite interesting about this week. So the big news is that Britain and America have now signed a very exciting memorandum of understanding on closer regulatory alignment, which sounds like the most boring phrase in the world, but is actually really important because it could help us speed up the delivery of nuclear power projects here in Britain.
Yeah, I think listeners would agree. This is pretty stirring stuff. We've talked about on the show a lot about how regulatory alignment is incredibly important because basically otherwise it means that if you want to build a nuclear power plant here, even if you're essentially copying the same designs that have been used in another country, you're having to start from scratch again in terms of what regulators are willing to approve. And this leads to ridiculous situations like conflicts about the exact amount of concrete that you should use over the reactor core in Hinkley Point C, for example, right?
Yeah, it's all just a nightmare of paperwork. It's a huge bureaucratic burden. It's wildly inefficient because it means that, for example, a British regulator, if it hadn't sort of said, we'll just take France's word for it, it might say take a reactor that's deemed safe by, America or France or South Korea or wherever and say, actually, we want these specific changes like the concrete you mentioned. And it means that every nuclear plant we build has to be this weird bespoke design, and that obviously pushes up the costs. So the idea is, with this alignment deal, with the US at least, is that basically the British regulators will be taking American regulators' word for it, and vice versa. They'll be working together. It's not complete sort of transparency. There will still be a process, but this should reduce it down. So when the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission sign off on a design, it should be able to sort of speed through our Office of Nuclear Regulation. And the big headline is this could apparently cut the time it takes to get stuff approved from sort of 3 or 4 years, as it is now, to around 2, which is good because that's twice as fast.
Yeah, this is excellent stuff, and it's something just to plug a previous episode. We had the former nuclear minister Lord Hunt on the pod at the end of July, and something he was very keen to see happen. But ultimately, so we've got an memorandum of understanding, or an MOU as they call it in the trade. But is that actually anything? Is it more than just a piece of paper? Is anything actually going to happen?
To be honest, I think it is probably a little bit vague, and I don't think it's got the same full force as a treaty. I mean, but who knows what a treaty means with Donald Trump at this point. But I think directionally, it's a very good thing because it means that a whole bunch more nuclear projects have basically been announced partially off the back of it, with a whole bunch of American companies getting involved in British nuclear.
Yeah, so we know that like Sizewell C, for example, in Suffolk is almost definitely happening after an announcement this summer that it got funding. Although these announcements are always quite difficult because we keep getting very excited and the government sort of says, hey, we've announced a nuclear power station. It's like, yes, it's one of a series of announcements over 10 years that might eventually lead to something being built. But, in any case, positive stuff. And then, of course, there's the small modular reactor competition that Rolls-Royce beat Hitachi to start working on. So there's stuff starting to come through. But is there anything beyond that that's being announced?
So this is why I think this is actually quite an interesting deal. If we assume it all pays off and things now happen off the back of it, because the Sizewell C and the Rolls-Royce reactor, they're sort of primarily taxpayer-funded things. Okay, it's more complicated than that. I wouldn't say primarily taxpayer-funded, but the government are the ones driving the car on that one. They're saying, we want to build this thing. Can industry build it for us? And the projects that were announced last week, they all appear to be significantly sort of more commercially driven projects. And don't get me wrong, they'll probably still require public money, taxpayers' money to do various, like, I know, enabling works or tax reliefs. You know how big complex things work, where you have to get the money from different things and twist the government's arms in different ways to get the money. But ultimately, I think this is companies wanting to build nuclear things because it could be profitable in their own right. And that could be good because if we know anything at the moment in Britain, it's that the Treasury doesn't have any money to spend of its own. So if the commercial world can pay for it, then we might actually get some more nuclear stuff happening and actually built, maybe.
So what are some of the specific announcements, James? Come on, educate us.
Okay, so I'm going to name a whole bunch of companies here, which I don't think most people will have ever heard of because they're all very nuclear specific, but they're sort of big deals. So a company called X Energy is teamed up with Centrica, who people will have heard of. They're planning to build 12 advanced modular reactors in Hartlepool, of all places, and that's going to generate, I think, 1.5 gigawatts of energy and power 1.5 million homes, which is cool. And then there's a team up between a company called Holec and Tritax. Again, I don't know where they get these names from. And then EDF Energy, the French energy company that we actually are familiar with in this country. They're now working on a small modular reactor in Cottam. This is one of these experimental, it's not full size, not Sizewell C size. This is a smaller thing like the Rolls-Royce reactor. They're trying to build that in Cottam, which Google Maps tells me is apparently just outside of Preston.
Yeah, and these are great locations as well, right? I think when people complain about the costs of nuclear, often they kind of forget that the money's being invested in jobs and infrastructure in parts of the UK that do really need levelling up, or in the case of Hartlepool, levelling. So it's quite a good thing for these places, and this is why you often see quite strong public support around the places that nuclear power stations are built.
Yeah, and I think many of these projects are being built on the sites of existing like power stations that are being closed down, like coal power stations and things like that. So I guess it's like people there, they're already used to living quite close to a power station.
Bathing in the warm glow, anyway.
So just to finish the list of companies that no one has ever heard of who are building things, Martin, Urenco and Radiant, they're building an advanced fuel facility somewhere to make nuclear fuel, I guess. That's going to be somewhere in Britain, hopefully. And then TerraPower and KBR. No idea either. They're going to be conducting a study to evaluate sites suitable for a natrium advanced reactor tech, which I'm sure nuclear people listening will be very excited about.
Fascinating stuff. I'd say that the studies are a little bit less impressive, the prototypes, but at least it's a step in the right direction, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think directionality is the thing here, and it's all going in the right direction. It appears that Britain is finally building some nuclear stuff, and if this regulatory alignment deal can help us get American companies involved in building stuff and building their reactors and building their designs, and hopefully doing it for a bit cheaper than Sizewell C and the like, then that can only be a good thing for us. And Martin, there was one other deal that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's for a very, very special reason. So the other big announcement was there's an American company called Last Energy. They make micro scale modular reactors. They've done a deal with DP World, who are the company that operate ports around the country, including the London Gateway port on the Thames, which is one of the biggest ports in the country, if not the biggest. And like I say, they've basically come up with this idea for a mass producible micro scale nuclear reactor. So this spits out, I think, 20 megawatts of power when it's built. So that sounds like a lot to me as a layperson, but compared to Sizewell C, it's basically nothing. Sizewell C is like 3.2 gigawatts. Even the Rolls-Royce SMR that's being built, that's going to be 470 megawatts. So this is a much smaller scale thing, but it's going to be used specifically for powering the port directly. It's not going to go into the grid. It's just going to plug directly into the port and help power port operations there.
Fantastic. And of course, the big controversy about small modular reactors is they still can't fit in my attic, James. It's still just a bit too big, sort of football pitch kind of scale, which means I'm stuck with solar for the foreseeable future, much to my annoyance. But I guess micro reactors, they're not quite getting to house sized, but they're getting a lot closer to that dream, right? It's the sort of stuff that you could put into a data center or a port or an airport and power like a nice area in a self-sufficient way.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it's a bit like out the Jetsons or that sort of retro futuristic thing where everyone's got a nuclear reactor just out back. So, like you say, you could have it so in the future, if these things take off, maybe it could be that every sort of major factory or every large business park has its own little smaller micro reactor powering it, which would I suppose that'd be quite good for resilience because it means at the moment with nuclear power stations or any power station, you've got this big old thing that if it goes down, it takes out a whole big slice of the country. Whereas if everyone's generating their own power locally or a significant slice of it locally, then that makes us a more resilient country as well. So anyway, I think it's a cool thing. And to find out more about this specific deal and the reason why this is very special is because this is amazing to me. We've actually got the CEO of Last Energy UK as a guest on our show this week, so stay tuned for that. Michael Jenner is his name. He's had a really busy week last week when we spoke to him. He was, this deal was being done. He was there meeting dignitaries. He was visiting Downing Street. I'm not entirely sure if he was at the palace, but he was definitely like shaking a lot of hands and meeting important people. And yet he took time out of his day to talk to us about the plans and sort of tell us more about what it's like actually on the ground trying to build nuclear in this country, what the sort of political and bureaucratic hurdles are. So stay tuned. Don't press pause on the show to keep listening to that. But first, Martin, we're going to talk about something a little bit different.